How long has he been gone? What time is it? He's making fools of us by inviting us here and not showing up. It's not the behavior of a gentleman, to say nothing of the waste of time. Yes, to say nothing of the waste of time.
Some food! A drink!
Relax. Try to relax. You have all the time in the world. You're right, David. That's exactly what I have. All the time in the world. Ever since I was little, on cold, snowy days, my dad would light a fire in the fireplace and put on the time machine. So let's go back, or should I say forward in time, and talk about this fun and endearing classic. The Time Machine was the first novel by the father of science fiction himself, H.G. Wells. In 1888, he published a short story in his college newspaper called The Chronic Argonauts, about an outcasted scientist living in a Welsh village. And when all the villagers burst into his house, he escapes on his invention called the Chronic Argo, which is a ship that sails through time. A few years later, Wells revised and expanded the story into a novella, where he created the term Time Machine. Wells thought it would make a great movie, but he died in 1946, leaving his son Frank, who was very protective over the time machine, in control of his estate. However, in 1953, the warm-hearted science fiction producer-director George Pal made War of the Worlds, which was based on another Wells story. And Frank Wells knew that George Pal was the man to make the time machine, and asked him if he would do it. Pal said yes, but for about 6 years, no studio was interested. Finally, MGM, who was having major financial problems, gave Pal a small budget of $750,000. He'd originally wanted to cast Paul Scofield, Michael Rennie, or James Mason to play the time traveler, but due to the budget, he had to settle on the then unknown Australian actor Rod Taylor. He also wanted to film in London, where the movie was set, but also due to the budget, had to settle on the MGM lot. They used a Victorian-style court set, as well as matte paintings to make London come alive. When he was a kid, George Pal loved going sledding. So for the time machine, he wanted a sled-like design. There was this huge dish, and an old-fashioned barber chair with the pedestal removed. They also used all sorts of special effects, like traveling matte shots, stop-motion animation, time-lapse photography, and oatmeal. Really, for the scene where they destroy London, they dyed the oatmeal red and had it be the lava, and it looks good. In front of the camera, George the Time Traveler forges ahead into the future. And behind the camera, George Pal and the rest were making film history. In England, it's New Year's Eve, 1899, and George Wells has just told his friends that he's invented a time machine. And they believe it's absolutely preposterous, and wonder what could even be gained by it. And his best friend David Philby is especially concerned for George. However, that evening, George sits in his time machine and goes to the future. First stop is 1917, where he sees David's adult son James, who was just a baby in 1899. And George finds out that David has been killed in World War I. His next stop is 1940, where he sees World War II. Then after that, it's 1966 for nuclear destruction, where James Philby is now a frightened old man. Barely escaping with his life, George goes to the year 802,701, where above ground is the Eloi, whom are these blonde teenagers whom live a life of mindless and careless leisure. And underground are the Morlocks. They come out at night and do the work for the Eloi, but when the Eloi boy or girl reaches maturity, the Morlocks eat them. After learning about their society through Weena, George tries to save the Eloi from the Morlocks and from themselves. The Time Machine is a super groovy science fiction adventure, but it's also a very personal story about one man and his reaction to traveling forward in time. The story opens in Victorian England, and it looks like a Christmas carol. Then we go into George's house, and there's clocks everywhere, and this group of very charming and warm actors. I mean, who's more likable than Alan Young? And Sebastian Cabot was the narrator for Winnie the Pooh. And the way they talk about and foreshadow the time travel reminds me of the foreshadowing in the Kansas scenes of The Wizard of Oz.
Fascinating. What is it?
This is just a small experimental model, of course. To carry a man, a larger edition is needed.
To carry a man? Where?
Into the past or into the future. This is a time machine. It's enchanting, and you enjoy suspending your disbelief to go on this adventure. The sets, the props, and special effects are so groovy to look at. And I especially love how the time machine is both old-fashioned and Victorian while still being futuristic. Now, all of us, well, most of us, care about the world. But I think we care most about the people that we love and our immediate environment, like the town that we live in. Now, the time machine always stays in the same spot, unless you physically push it. So even 1,000 years into the future, it's still in that same spot. So all the changes that we see are either from George's street when he goes outside, or from outside of George's window. So we see the sun rise and fall outside of George's window. We see his flowers bloom. And you see the mannequin changing clothes in Philby's dress shop window. These aren't huge deals, but they are the little things that you would notice if you were traveling forward in time. And it's by talking to his best friend's son, James Philby, that George figures out what's going on in the world. By the way, Alan Young magnificently plays both David Philby and his son James Philby. And when it's your best friend's son, it practically feels like a nephew. And by having it be the same actor, it really enforces that emotional connection. Oh, I think you're confusing me with my father, sir. There was quite a resemblance. I'm James Philby. Was? Were you a friend of father's? He was killed in the war a year ago. Oh. I'm so sorry. Have you been to the front? What front? Why, the war, of course. What war? Good heavens, you mean you don't know we've been at war with Germany since 1914? He doesn't even hear the word war at first. It's his friend dying that affects him. In 1917, his best friend's son is sort of sad. He just got back from World War I and lost his dad. Then in 1966, he's a frightened old man. And that's how George finds out that the world is frightened of nuclear destruction. Now when George goes into the far future, he falls in love with this nice Eloy girl named Weena. And that's how George and the audience start to care about the Eloy. So no matter what time period it is, we always feel personally connected to and understand the emotions of what's going on. Now part of that is the writing, but it's also because we're so connected to Rod Taylor. So let's talk about our time traveler. In the book, the main character actually doesn't have a name. So for the movie, they named him H. George Wells after the author. Rod Taylor said that when he first walked onto the set and saw the time machine, that he believed that he could actually travel through time. And you could tell he believes it. And he makes you believe it. Because even though he's intelligent, he has this childlike sense of wonder. He even giggles at the mannequin as it's wearing less and less clothes. He gets discouraged and disgusted with all the wars and with the non-caring attitude of the Eloy. But he also has this eternal hope, which is why he keeps going forward, and why he tries to help the Eloy. What have you done? Thousands of years of building and rebuilding, of creating and recreating so you can let it crumble to dust! Million years of sensitive men dying for their dreams so you can swim and dance and play! He's got such a spirit of adventure too, and not just with the time travel, because near the end when he fights the Morlocks, he just goes all in and becomes like an action hero. It's so exciting. Now, before my dad actually showed me the movie, the thing he built up the most was the Morlocks. You're gonna love the Morlocks. You're gonna love the Morlocks. Wait till you see the Morlocks. And if you're looking for a good monster, the Morlocks do not disappoint. They're these hideous creatures that live underground and only come out at night. They have machines, so they're more advanced than the Eloi, and when they ring the siren, the Eloi mindlessly enter the Sphinx, never to return. Before they reveal the Morlocks, we get little glimpses of them behind bushes, and when George listens to the talking rings, we find out what they are.
This is a talking ring? Make it talk.
My name is of no consequence. The important thing you should know is that I am the last who remembers how each of us, man and woman, made his own decision. Some chose to take refuge in the great caverns and find a new way of life far below the Earth's surface. The rest of us decided to take our chances in the sunlight, small as those chances might be.
We see George's reaction, but we're really picturing it in our own imaginations. It's a horrifying thought. Then when we go underground, we see human skeletons. And that's when we know that the Morlocks are eating the Eloi. Yum, 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 yum. So the suspense builds, and we know the full extent of their gruesomeness before the Morlocks are finally revealed.
So this was the destiny of the Eloi. They were being bred by the Morlocks, who degenerated into the lowest form of human life, cannibalism.
Then and now, the Morlocks are my favorite part, so my dad was right. However, as I went forward in time, I began to learn about the movie's lesson. The movie is so entertaining that you could watch it without even thinking about the lesson. But they actually have a pretty good one. It's anti-war because of all the damage it does, but with the understanding that sometimes you do have to stand up for yourself.
Now, when H.G. Wells wrote the book, he saw it more as a story about social class, with the working class being like the Morlocks. In fact, in London, live-in staff usually had their rooms in the underground level. And the Eloi are like the aristocracy, who are about to have their world shattered. For 1960s America, the threat of nuclear war was more relevant, and a popular theme with science fiction. As George goes through the centuries trying to find an era with no war, he gets more than he bargains for with the Eloi, who are so passive that they don't even help Weena when she drowns. And George teaches them how to fight and fend for themselves and take control of their lives.
You need to learn that balance, because you want peace. It's so important, but you also have to know when to make a stand. And how do you know how to be firm with what's right and not aggressive with what's wrong? With knowledge. And George goes back to 1900 to bring the Eloi 3 books. It's not like George to return empty-handed, to try to rebuild a civilization without a plan. He must have taken something with him. Nothing. Except 3 books. Which 3 books? I don't know. Is it important? Oh, I suppose not. Only, which 3 books would you have chosen? When asked, even George Pell didn't know what the books were. But I like that they leave it up to your interpretation, because it's whatever you personally think are the three most important books.
The Time Machine book inspired a whole subgenre of time travel science fiction stories. You wouldn't have Back to the Future if it wasn't for H.G. Wells. And both the book and the movie are classics. The film even won an Oscar for Best Special Effects. George Pal took home the small time machine model, but it was unfortunately destroyed in the Bel Air fires. The full-scale model was sold at a Hollywood auction. The person who bought it went around the country with other movie props and sold admission to see it. He ended up having to sell it, and sci-fi enthusiast Bob Burns bought it at a thrift store and restored it. George Pal wanted to make a sequel to The Time Machine. Several scripts were submitted to MGM, but they were all rejected. Rod Taylor felt that Pal died of a broken heart because of it. Over a decade after Pal's death, there was a documentary called Time Machine: A Journey Back, and one segment of it featured Rod Taylor, Alan Young, and Whit Bissell reprising their roles for a mini-sequel. Alan Young would reprise the role of Philby again in a cameo in the 2002 remake, which was directed by Simon Wells, the great-grandson of H.G. Wells.
The Time Machine is a wonderful story, and with this movie, they tell it in the most charming way. So I give it 4 Morlocks out of 4. And now, back to the 2020s. Well, at least I got it half right. So, thank you for watching Dusty Old Movies, and I'll see you in the future.